Hello, welcome to this mini episode of Ambivalent Offenders. We have a returning guest, the one, the only, my husband, Matthew, who is also a American history teacher, which is very useful in a situation like this. Do you want to say hello, Matthew?
Well, they've managed to get me back in front of the microphone to talk about a subject I'll have to tread carefully on, because if my students listen to this, they're always trying to tease out my opinions. And I don't want them to get their opinions from me. I want them to cultivate their own informed, historically sophisticated perspective. So you may find me extra annoying during this particular podcast.
Oh, don't worry. I always find you annoying.
Well, that's good to hear.
I'm just kidding. He has been a history teacher for how long?
32 years.
So you are an expert. You are an expert in this. So let's just kick it off. Obviously, the big question would be, when did Bleeding Kansas start bleeding? AKA, when did the violence really start to kick in? And I know you're probably going to want to reverse and give us some context about what happens before Bleeding Kansas becomes Bleeding Kansas. So you start wherever you think you need to start.
Oh, I need to be careful that I don't abuse that permission structure, because
Gotta go back to...
we were talking in the car before we kicked on the microphone, and I was taking Erin all the way back to the Articles of Confederation and the initial 1787 compromise on slavery north and south of the Ohio River. I could go back to 1619 if you want. So you're asking, when does Kansas start to bleed? Let me just hit that straight on. The law that establishes the Kansas and Nebraska territories, which, although I'm from Missouri, I'm
not from Missouri.
I'm a proud Nebraskan as well. I would point out that the actual, let me push my glasses up here. Actually, it's an act for the establishment of the Nebraska and Kansas territories. So
you're recording this in Nebraska right now.
We are in Omaha. It's the Nebraska-Kansas Act, technically, but everybody knows it as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And I have a hunch if you ask most Americans to find Kansas on a map, they'd probably struggle to find both Kansas and Nebraska. But they'd have a better shot at Kansas, probably. Anyway, 1854, the moment the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the ink is drying, and there are already pro- and anti-slavery settlers moving into Kansas under this doctrine of popular sovereignty, which I'm sure you'll have a question about.
If you want to go back, let's talk about the Missouri Compromise, because if you guys are listening to this, you probably have already listened to the John Brown episode, and Jamie mentioned the Missouri Compromise in passing, but this is a mini-sode for a reason. Let's get into more detail.
Okay. If you are listening to this, it might be helpful to hop onto the Google machine and just pull up a map of the United States, or even ask it to spit out an animated map, just a simple search, map, animation, U.S. states. It will show you each state entering the Union.
What's animated? Does it just have like smiley things?
Some of them do. Some of them are very patriotic, and the states are color-coded, and you see the state flower open its petals to the sun as soon as it enters into our glorious Union. Teachers throughout the country use these to try and illustrate the complexity of this problem. Because what you have to come to grips with is the fact that there really are three Wests in American history. Our first West, from the 1760s, back when we were part of the British Empire, was, you'll appreciate this, Michigan girl, go blue. It was the Ohio Valley, which I know you won't appreciate it, called the Ohio Valley. But
the Michigan Valley.
Yeah, that was ground zero for conflict between indigenous peoples, France's claims in North America.
Well, that's about as far west as you got back then.
Right. It was coveted by all the European powers, and it was fought over during what we would call the French and Indian War, or what the rest of Earth called the 7 Years' War. It was fought over during the American Revolution. And it was one of the prizes. It was the trophy territory of the Second Treaty of Paris, 1783. That's kind of our, if the Declaration of Independence is our birth certificate, I guess the Treaty of Paris is like it's like our baptismal certificate. It's like Britain gives up and says, all right, you can have the Ohio Valley. And already by that point, there had been settlement in what we would call Kentucky and Tennessee. And there had been white settlement in what we would call Ohio and Indiana. And 4 years after the Treaty of Paris, the Confederation Congress, before we even have a constitution, this is the Articles of Confederation. So now you got to think back to high school government class.
Don't make me go back.
They adopt a regulatory principle in something called the Northwest Ordinance, which states that Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, the old Northwest, Frontier 1.0, America's First West, slavery will be prohibited there. And my students often applaud that. Oh, that's wonderful. They have the moral imagination to see that enslavement violates social contract theory. This is incompatible with our values.
Not so much.
Well, the law is silent on slavery south of the Ohio River in Kentucky, Tennessee, eventually Alabama.
A big silence.
A big silence, which is often the way, history often has to be read through the rhythm that you see in the spaces, right? What goes unsaid? It's harder to recreate the values that were held by our ancestors that they were so enraptured by that they never even bothered to articulate them, right? It's just sort of an unspoken understanding. But in this case, it's a somewhat principled understanding that they see slavery as this unfortunate baggage of the colonial period, and they envision a future where it won't be a part of our national institutions in the next generation, at least not north of the Ohio River, which to their credit, that was the land that they did perceive to be more valuable.
Yeah. And before we chatted here, we talked about, and you do get early 1800s. But when does, so England or the UK?
Britain bails on the international slave trade in 1807. And we get out of it in 1809.
But there's a big but.
Well, yeah, the big but would be that's the very first year the Constitution allows for American participation in the international slave trade to be regulated. So in that sense, we're jumping on the problem immediately. And it is Jefferson who signs that.
Famously the best and hottest of state founding fathers.
Famously, I think, tormented by his own charitably described inconsistencies, maybe more accurately
Do you think he's tormented?
Described hypocrisy.
Oh, we're going to have to talk about this offline. Do you think he's actually tormented?
Oh, I think it bothers him, yeah.
Good for him.
But like a lot of men, Jefferson's critics said he had a talent for voicing contradictions that he could cloud with so much poetry and abstractions that he never really had to deal with like the concrete conflict on the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, here's a man who's being served his dinner by someone he considers to have complete lordship over as property, and that person is also his son, right? But that's probably a podcast for a different day.
We will get you on the pod to talk about that.
Well, again, I want my kids to be able to argue about that on their own. I just want to give them some possible angles to take. And
okay.
Anyway.
Well, back to the transatlantic slave trade.
So what that means is that with the United States exit from the international slave trade, if you are looking to move into the old Southwest as a white slaveholder, which remember for them, the old Southwest it's not Texas, it's not Southern California, it's not New Mexico, it's Mississippi, it's Alabama. But thanks to the cotton gin, that grossly oversimplified transitional technology we all learn about in middle school that probably was not invented by Eli Whitney.
Oh, really? Damn.
Yeah, it probably came out of the Caribbean. Yeah.
The one thing everybody knows.
Well, he did some other things too.
Okay.
But suddenly, eventually, you can see the economic trajectory. There's going to be billions of dollars to be made in cotton and to a lesser extent sugar production in the Southwest. And all you have to do is get the labor force from the old South to the new. So that means if you could teleport yourself back to the 19th century and just kind of hover over the Atlantic, you would see these steamships trawling the coast, engaged in this barbaric separation of husbands from wives and parents from children, as hundreds of thousands of Black families are migrated forcibly into the Mississippi Delta, eventually after the Louisiana Purchase, and Georgia and Mississippi to engage in cotton production.
So they don't need the transatlantic slave trade anymore because we have our own slave trade.
Exactly. And because we're no longer in the international market for human trafficking, it's a supply and demand equation. Suddenly, a slaveholder in Maryland or Virginia, like Jefferson himself, who most of his slaves were sold, most of them were not freed. It's a way for the Old South. It's a way for the old Jeffersonian Piedmont elite of a place like Virginia to somehow survive the economic transition. And the next generation of white Southerners tends to be much more, they're not apologists for slavery. People like John C. Calhoun and James Hammond, they describe it as a positive good. It's ordained in scripture.
Damn.
It's good for the enslaved. It's good for the slaveholder. It's a much more, like a Marxist historian would say, well, yeah, that's all the ugliness of capitalism and all the moral barbarity of like racial hierarchy put in a blender and turned into this horrible soup.
So you no longer have Jefferson trying
For the record, I'm not a Marxist historian, but
so
I understand where they're coming from.
You no longer have Jefferson trying to put his pretty language on top of it. This is unapologetic.
Right. When Jefferson writes about slavery, he usually describes it, at least in his public voice, as this, it is the destiny of the African peoples within our own borders to be free. But he's utterly incapable. Most white men of his generation, they're not capable of conceiving of like a multiracial society or democracy, which in a weird sort of way means that they're blind to the very cosmopolitan, complex society that's already unfolding before their own eyes, because most of the northern states adopts emancipation, gradual emancipation, in the aftermath of the Revolution. So there's already a growing free Black population.
So it's not imaginary. They just have to look
a
little bit northward.
And that's the word is, plus by the 1830s, Virginia is 30% enslaved, probably, obviously 70% not, but then within those who are living in freedom, there's a sizable number of free Black families who definitely don't enjoy the same status or privileges or economic opportunities that their white counterparts do. But, Jefferson engages in correspondence with Benjamin Banneker. He knows, he can see the intellectual contradiction. But sometimes the way I put it is his moral character is obviously flawed. His moral orientation is obviously not, right? He articulates the doctrine of the equality of all men.
What?
Frederick Douglass gives him credit for that. But the real failure is moral imagination. That's they cannot conceive of what lies beyond the pale of slavery. Could we be a multiracial society? That's just, to their defenders, well, it's not realistic for us to expect that of somebody living in the early 19th century. I don't know. I think by the early 19th century, that becomes a harder question. Anyway, that's the standing compromise. North of the Ohio River, it can't exist. South of the Ohio River, it can. Then, again, back to Jefferson. We got to get to John Brown, but the Louisiana Purchase is his product.
Yep.
And this is where most students stumble, because we like to think of white settlement as sort of like somebody emptying a jar onto a flat surface. And the United States just pours over the continent in this spill of manifest destiny instead of
manifest destiny.
That term hasn't been coined yet. That comes out in the 1840s. But the second West, America 2.0, I know this will break your hearts, but it's not Nebraska. It's not the Dakotas. It's not Colorado. Any white family in Nebraska in the 1830s is on their way to Oregon or California. The second West is the Pacific Northwest and California. And there was a huge debate in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War about, will California be slavery-free? And by that point, the debate finally starts to take on not just an economic and political dimension, but it also starts to have a more moral undertone. Sadly, even by that point, there are probably 180, 200,000 abolitionists in a country of 30 million people. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if they were arguing about, I can't believe what you're doing to families and children. This is inhumane. This is unethical. And there are definitely vocal abolitionists like John Brown, but also Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Theodore Weld, Charles Finney. They're William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass. They're there. Their voice is outsized, but they're North and South. They're perceived as a fringe minority political element. Democrats, the dominant political party at the time, and Whigs, the kind of the ancestor to the Republican Party and the child of the Federalists. To the extent that they have dialogue with the abolitionists, it's mostly out of anxiety that if they don't do something to pacify them, their supporters might depart the tent for a third party, and that they'll end up losing an election by 1 or 2% because of the slavery question. So when Americans argue about slavery during this period, for the most part, they're arguing about the economics of it. Like, I don't want my child to move west and have to compete against slave labor. I don't want those.
It's not family separation. It's not the fact that somebody's working for you with no money.
It's difficult to unpack, right? Because we don't have opinion poll surveys. We don't.
I would love to see those.
Yeah, it would be a really complex matrix of values about it. But I think it's definitely the case that for most of the debate, it's not really about the morality of slavery. It's about the political and economic impact of it. And then also the fear of it spreading.
Yeah. So let's go to Kansas, Nebraska.
So here it happens. So by the time you get to the early 1850s, they've worked out California statehood. It's going to be a free state.
Well,
Texas has joined the Union, although that happened before the Mexican-American War by joint resolution of the House and the Senate. We've worked out our border dispute with British Canada over Oregon.
Suffolk, Canada.
And now suddenly there is talk of a transcontinental railroad. You know, the ultimate infrastructure improvement to the United States. We're going to build a railroad that will connect the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. Now, there's already a pretty robust rail network.
I was about to say, I'm just go there.
It extends to roughly Chicago and St. Louis.
But now we want to go further.
Right. Now, if you ask the South, if you ask any House member or senator or a Wall Street investor, how are we going to build a railroad that's this big? They're going to fire back and say, well, it's probably going to require some degree of federal assistance. And the South makes the argument, well, why don't we start the railroad in St. Louis?
Your birthplace?
My hometown. And
which is what state? That's why they wanted to start.
Because they knew I would be born there. And they said, let's start it in St. Louis, Missouri. Let's extend it on a southeasterly route through Texas and into what you and I would call New Mexico and Arizona, terminating ultimately in Southern California. There's a lot of logical reasons to do that. The Mississippi River is the spine of the continent. Steamboat traffic is going up and down the Mississippi at incredible volume. South of St. Louis, the Ohio River connects to the Mississippi. So that would give you steamboat traffic all the way up to the pre-existing canal network of the 1820s, America's emergent industrial sector. There's a lot of good reasons to start it in St. Louis and have it go south and east. But if it does go south and east, it's going to go into New Mexico and Arizona, which at this time are unorganized territories. And to try and avoid having any kind of contentious, bitter discussion about slavery's expansion, in 1850, Congress adopted a compromise that Stephen A. Douglas helped to craft that essentially said, kind of implicitly, I suppose, that the House of Representatives isn't going to talk about slavery in the Southeast, or excuse me, the Southwest, I should say. The Senate isn't going to talk about it. The Supreme Court isn't going to talk about it. The president isn't going to. We're just going to let the people who move to New Mexico and Arizona, they're going to decide.
This is why people hate the government. This is why people hate Congress. They say, I want hands off. Or we're not going to do anything about it. It's all on you. And
right. So if you're somebody like Abraham Lincoln, you look at this and you go, oh my God, how far we have drifted from our original roots here. Even before the Constitution existed, under the Articles, we said enslavement, the interaction with another human being as if they are property. That is such a grotesque idea that to the extent that we allow it at all, it has to be regulated by the national authority. I mean, this speaks directly to the social contract. You are explicitly excluding an entire community from the social contract. And so this is not something that you should just let people vote on like it's a bond issue for a school district.
Now it sounds ridiculous, but I guess, in 50, 60, 100 years, people might be thinking about the same things that we're talking about right now.
And they console themselves with the knowledge, no offense to anyone listening from New Mexico or Arizona, they consoled themselves with the knowledge that they didn't think they were going to get bitten a second time. There was some talk of doing the same thing with California, but before that conversation could go very long, gold was discovered there, and suddenly California had more than 100,000 people overnight, and they were applying to be a state.
The gold rush.
Right. It wasn't thought that would probably happen in Arizona and New Mexico anytime soon. So the compromise stands, and already in 1851, 1852, so now you have these two compromises, the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. So there's already talk in 1851, 1852 that maybe this Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois, this Democrat, maybe he represents the third generation of American leadership. We had the framers, Washington, Adams, Jefferson. They're off the radar at this point. The Jacksonian era is starting to come to a close. Andrew Jackson himself is gone by this point. So here's Stephen A. Douglas, and he's pulled it off. We've reached the Pacific coast. We didn't kill ourselves.
Another slow clap.
Another slow clap. And so he's now thinking to himself, well, okay, this transcontinental railroad that starts in St. Louis and goes into what you and I would call Oklahoma and then Texas and the Southwest. I would much rather it start in Chicago, Illinois.
I would too. Great deep dish pizza.
And the U.S. Army has surveyed a route across Iowa to a place called Canesville, that you and I would call Council Bluffs.
Oh, nice.
And
that's right. It's not far from where we're speaking right now.
Exactly. They've done some engineering specs, and there's a lot of good reasons to run the railroad through what's left of the Louisiana Purchase to the north. Now, there's a big argument against it, which is eventually you will hit this small obstacle called the Rocky Mountains. And that might obstruct your path to the Pacific Ocean. But it would mean that Chicago, Illinois would get all the benefits of that initial transcontinental route. And it's already on Lake Michigan, so it's participating in the steamboat traffic. And
it has the Chicago Cubs, which are the best MLB.
Sadly, at this point, it does not yet have the Chicago.
Sorry, guys. I've got an email.
My beloved St. Louis Cardinals don't exist yet either. They're about to. They're about 30 years away.
I've 40 years away. I just have to needle you. That's why they chose it. Let's actually, deep dish pizza and the Chicago.
This debate over the railroad is what sets up the earliest bitter rivalry between St. Louis and Chicago, because St. Louis would benefit just as much as Chicago would if it could be the eastern terminus. Now here comes the problem. every time Douglas floats his railroad bill, it's blocked. Southern senators say, Mr. Douglas, why would we support your transcontinental railroad bill, your trans-Pacific railway ideas, when it's going to go through all of this old Louisiana Purchase territory, which under the Missouri Compromise cannot be legal for slavery. It's all it means is eventually, as farm families settle along the railroad spur, they'll reach the threshold to apply for statehood.
So they're scared that they're going to be outnumbered.
Right, that their way of life will be marginalized yet again. Right, we already lost California. We lost California, about 5 years ago. We got Missouri back in 1820, but we didn't get anything else. The Louisiana Purchase. We got Texas, but we had to fight for that. We had to go to war with Mexico. So we're not willing. We are not going to support this measure. It's a hard pass.
And then Stephen Douglas says,
Douglas says, I got a clever idea. What if we take what's left of the Louisiana Purchase and we don't subdivide it into, at least initially, we cut it into two pieces. There will be a Kansas territory, which will be this, no offense to Kansas, but it will be this adorable little rectangle immediately to the left of Missouri. And everything else, all the way up to the Canadian border, all the way up to the 49th parallel, that's going to be Nebraska.
Yeah, that's
so North Dakota it's Nebraska at this point. South Dakota, it's Nebraska
Maybe
at
we
this
should
point.
take back our old Nebraska territory.
It would make for some long bus rides for high school football players on their way to championship games and playoffs.
I'm just throwing out there. Maybe we should take back what was ours.
And then speaking of high school, this is where you may have some algebraic flashbacks. So this was his logic, most likely, as far as we can gather. There are 4 possible outcomes. Okay. I'm going to get rid of the ridiculous one right now. What if we should back up. I've kind of buried the most important part here. Why are we cutting these? Why are we drawing this line across the middle of this territory and saying there's going to be a Nebraska above it and a Kansas below it? Because we're going to let the people who settle in Kansas and Nebraska decide.
Ding, ding, ding. States' rights.
Popular sovereignty.
States' rights.
Now, Douglas.
States' rights for.
A territory's right. A territory's right.
This is what, anytime anybody says states' rights, Matt goes, states' rights for what?
States' rights is often coded language for racial hierarchy, but not always.
Uh-huh.
If you ask a California environmentalist, why do you believe in states' rights? They're going to say, well, because I want to go farther than the UPA.
Pre-1860s. What does it mean?
Well, you're going to find out that there will be states who use states' rights principles to try and resist slavery's expansion. So I'm going to be really difficult here, and you can punch me if you want.
But you are being very much a teacher.
I know. Well, you shouldn't care what I think. You should develop your own informed perspective. So his logic is that if we create these 2 territories instead of 1, then allowing people who move into those territories to vote as to whether or not they want to enter the Union with slavery or without, it lets him wash his hands of the problem. It lets him get his railroad. And then realistically, again, let's go through the possible outcomes. Could Nebraska become a slave state? And could Kansas become a free state? It's unlikely. It's hard to imagine making slave-based agriculture work in northern Nebraska. You can go outside right now to see why. It takes 200 days without frost to get cotton safely to harvest. So
we're not making no cotton in Nebraska.
Not that enslaved labor is always used in agriculture. It sadly has all sorts of other applications. The institution has all sorts of other applications, but plus that would mean northern Nebraska would be right on Canada's doorstep, free British Canada's doorstep. So Nebraska slave, Kansas free, not likely to happen. Nebraska slave, Kansas slave, not likely to happen. Same reason, right? Here's what could happen. Slaveholders from Missouri, Tennessee, Mississippi, they might move to Kansas and they might make it a slave state. Anti-slavery settlers from Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin Territory, Minnesota, they'll come to Nebraska and probably make it a free state.
Essentially, you're getting the Missouri Compromise, you're getting the free state, slave state, but wink, wink, we're not saying that.
Right. Douglas gets to say, I didn't really repeal the Missouri Compromise. Right. The spirit of the Missouri Compromise is maintained because when Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, Maine entered the Union as a free state, and the balance was maintained in the Senate. Now, it's also possible, this is probably, in my opinion at least, this is what I think Douglas thought would happen. I think Douglas actually thought that Kansas would go free and Nebraska would also go free, but he would still be able to tell the white South, well, I gave you the opportunity
I tried
to do something that never would have been.
It's very like a parent or something.
And then Douglas would be able to say, I gave the country the Compromise of 1850 that brought us to the Pacific coast without violence. I then gave you the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed us to stitch the country together, the Transcontinental Railroad. You should make me president in 1860.
And that did not happen.
It did not happen. Shortly after the law we just described.
It actually happened.
So pro-slavery settlers storm into Kansas. Anti-slavery settlers storm into Kansas. And they begin butchering one another. And you have political violence in Kansas well into 1860, 1861.
Which is when
by that point, the Civil War has started. Kansas at that stage does enter the Union as a free state. And it's not just, I say it's not just vanilla retaliatory murder.
What's the rocky road? What's the there's peanut butter chocolate. And that's vanilla.
There's mutilation. There's, sort of theatrical violence where pro-slavery settlers will murder anti-slavery settlers and hack them up.
And this is not just John Brown.
This is prior to John Brown's arrival. So
John Brown is...
His sons are there. He's not. He's back east and he's really trying to prepare for retirement. And then a letter from his kids saying, we need you in Kansas. And by this point, even though earlier in his life, he stood up in church and vowed that he would dedicate the rest of his life to the destruction of slavery. At this point, as far as we can tell, he was preparing to kind of retreat into the background. As you know from your podcast, he had plenty of kids to carry the battle without him. But he does reluctantly go to Kansas and organizes the family. Supposedly, there is a night where he gets word that back in Washington, there's a Senate debate going on called, it's come to be called it's the Senate debate that produces the caning of Charles Sumner. Right. And when he hears about that, he just goes into a fury. He walks out of the cabin and this always makes listeners sort of, I shouldn't say listeners. My students sometimes react curiously to this statement, but it's in several different sources. He sits down in front of the stars and he talks to God. And then he begins what comes to be called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre.
Just trying to put it in context, John Brown's, it's not like he's single-handedly being a vigilante in Kansas. This is across the board.
Right. He's participating in a kind of dress rehearsal for the Civil War.
We've already talked about John Brown. So if somehow you're listening to this episode without listening to that one, go back, listen to that one, because that will conclude John Brown's story and what happens there. But what ultimately happens to Kansas? What ultimately happens to Kansas? What ultimately happens to Kansas once, obviously, the Civil War kicks in? Does it eventually cool down? Does the bleeding stop?
Yes and no. Most of the sort of organized militia violence has subsided by 1862. And
Is that because they're all fighting in the actual war?
that's part of it. The other element of it is that by that point, certainly by 1863, after the summer of 1863, when Vicksburg falls and the South is sort of cut in half, and your friend Erin is a big admirer of Ulysses Grant, and he's brought out of the West to take over.
He's on the short list. We're gonna have to cover him.
Yeah, so I know you have strong opinions about Ulysses S. Grant. So anyway, by that point, Kansas does start to calm down, but you have to kind of say sort of, because here's a strange thing that happens. In like the 1950s Hollywood imaginations, by the time you get to the 1870s, in the aftermath of the war, the West is this untamed frontier space characterized by stagecoach robberies and train heists,
Buffalo Bill,
shootouts at high noon.
Buffalo Bill, the Wells Fargo wagon.
Right. And there actually isn't a lot of evidence for that kind of schmaltzy Hollywood.
Don't ruin it for us.
But what there is a lot of evidence for is that a lot of those guerrilla gangs, like Frank and Jesse James, they cut their teeth. They kind of became inaugurated in this lifestyle when they participated in Bleeding Kansas.
Oh, really?
It's like,
this is a training ground.
Right. It's like, why am I blowing up this bank? Well, this bank is lending money to anti-slavery settlers. So I'm really blowing up this bank. This bank has to burn for my politics. Right? Which, maybe while the bank burns, some of the money inside doesn't have to burn. Maybe I could keep some of that to finance our glorious cause, right? And then you see this a lot in organized, quote unquote, organized military conflict. Some men in the aftermath of war can't transition back to civilian life. It's just not compatible with the worldview that's been thrust upon them by any recent experience.
You can't just turn it off. It's not a light switch.
Right. And so
which wasn't even invented then.
Exactly.
So
it's about to be,
they would really not know what a light
switch is. The Cubs and Cardinals and the light switch are all about to be invented.
Which one? Rank them.
In terms of importance, obviously, the St. Louis Cardinals would be far more important than electricity. So. But we do appreciate electricity because, the light bulb allows you to see all of your world championship title. Because we're almost out of fingers and toes to count them all. Anyway, so that kind of like guerrilla vigilante violence does continue. It's just rather than describe them as disgruntled ex-Confederates animated by white supremacy, Hollywood prefers to make them...
They're cowboys.
They're cowboys. Well, they're outlaws, right?
Interesting. It's obviously not about slavery at this point. It becomes about something more intangible.
I would say so. And then you see that. Then you get the history of the histories. You get the argument about what history have we just experienced. So I noticed in your Instagram feed, you have the Hovenden painting, which has the very.
Do you want to describe? What?
Yeah, this is it's Hovenden. It's a Gilded Age painting, or from Erin's perspective, because she's a world history woman, the Victorian era. In America, we have to call it the Gilded Age. What do we care about Queen Victoria? Albert means nothing to us.
Hey, don't speak ill about Albert.
I'm sure he was a nice boy.
They were in love.
I know.
Just like us.
Well, not exactly like us. We don't command an empire, but
yeah, we're also not sending our inbred children out to the rest of Europe to sit on thrones.
And I don't claim to control like India either. But. So that painting, again, Hovenden, the Thomas, I believe, a Hovenden painting. It is a very emotive, gentle, intimate portrait of John Brown on his way to the gallows.
Definitely not scary.
He's not some
Grandfather
kind
Blue.
of, he's not some kind of overpowering, menacing figure.
Compare it to the actual pictures of John Brown,
Right.
which we do reference in the podcast, Velociraptor.
He knew how to
terrify.
He had a piercing gaze. There's no doubt about it.
As I said, I'm going to eat your family.
But then if you look at the Kansas Capitol mural, the 1942 painting, that one, he's made to look like some sort of otherworldly giant, right? That one's called Tragic Prelude. And that one, he's depicted as maniacal and unhinged. And it shows you, oil on canvas, it shows you how conflicted Americans are about him. When you poll Black American families, how do you feel about John Brown? You get a much more compellingly optimistic portrayal. He's not necessarily a dangerous lunatic. He's a freedom fighter.
As Frederick Douglass said, I lived for the slave. He died for the slave.
Yeah, right. There were, Frederick Douglass was invited to participate.
Luckily, or did that invitation conveniently get lost in the mail?
Oh, no, I think Douglass would tell you that he'd already been through in his own escape from Maryland.
I'm over it.
It's like, well, I think he probably would have said, I've already put my life into the crucible here to try and advance this cause. I don't think what you're trying to do has much chance of success. So,
true.
But I think Douglass there it's not that Douglass isn't courageous. He's just a little more irrational.
Absolutely. Before we sign off, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wish that people would know about John Brown or Bleeding Kansas? Keep in mind, I think you're going to be invited back at the ultimate judgment time, not the final judgment, our final judgment. Erin Burr, and I hope you're going to be at my final judgment.
So this is going to be John Brown versus Erin Burr. Interesting.
So don't tell me your ultimate decision now, because we've got to get people.
Do I have to make up my mind, or can't I just say something that's sort of circular and?
Not right now, but I just mean, is there anything else you want to tell people before? And
I would say John Brown he's incredibly valuable as like a historical port of entry into a deeper question about political violence. I often ask my students to pull up Thomas Aquinas's criteria for a just war, his rubric for a just war. The cause has to be a truly compelling moral outrage.
You have to
have a reasonable chance of success. You must engage in this violent conduct under the sanction of a uniformed, organized military. You can't just sort of improvise your own solution. And then you sort of have to go through these one by one and say, well...
But is it really a pro-con, or not your pro-con? He checks off these ones. Can you really weigh it in that?
Right. Like, for many of my students who find him dangerous and unsettling will immediately say, and not that this is indicative of my opinion, but they'll immediately say, well, what about that criteria in Aquinas's rubric for a just war, that you should never allow for bloodshed, you should never compel bloodshed until every other peaceful avenue has been exhausted. And I think John Brown would say, well, we've tried that.
We've done that.
Senators are being beaten on the floors of Congress.
And they're not willing to. Stephen Douglas he's kind of washing his hand. He's saying we're not going to solve it in the Senate. We're not going to solve it in the House of Representatives. So what other choice do you have?
Right. And we've been supposedly trying to walk away from this institution since independence.
Yeah, but the long walk.
It's like a hydra. It refuses to be contained. And then of course, the other, I think, unsettling question to then ask yourself is, if you do think this man is a murderer, if you do think he's an unhinged vigilante, then you have to ask yourself, well, a year after his execution, blood is being spilled to achieve pretty much the exact same outcomes. and innocent people are getting caught in the crossfire. And what's changed? Oh, well, the people that are spilling the blood now have a blue uniform. So that's it.
That sanctifies it.
That it's just the fabric, that you're cloaked in when you do it. I mean, that's
we're gonna have to weigh those when we talk about Erin Burr versus John Brown.
Well, I will look forward to that, but I'm reluctant to share my actual opinion.
Well, too bad.
I guess that's the whole point of your podcast.
It is. You're gonna have to share your opinion.
Okay. Can I recommend a book real quick?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Recommend away.
All right. So the most recent literature on this that I really fell in love with is, he's got a couple of books on this topic, but I'm going to share the one that I've read like 2 or 3 times now. Freedom National is the title. I'm trying to get the details on it here. It's James Oakes, and Oakes, and it's not explicitly or specifically about Brown. To me, it's a really powerful exploration of the new scholarship on this question of what were Americans' attitudes, and was the Civil War animated by this desire to have a final moral confrontation every year. It really forces us to re-examine some of these core issues in a new way.
Interesting. I haven't read that. I'm going to put that on my list. All right. Well, thank you, Matthew.
All right. You did it again. You were up in the end.
This is why I love him. I'm sure everybody else loves you. They're going to be clamoring for a Just Matthew podcast, and you're going to put us out of business.
I highly doubt that.
If you do do your own podcast, can you just call it Just Matthew? It's trademark it.
I could try that. I have a hunch there's probably a couple of Just Matthews already out there, but.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you guys for listening. Again, please rate, review, subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. And there's always information on our Instagram about Patreon. We are going to be continuing our Wolf Hall recap historical analysis series on the Patreon. And I believe we might be having more Matthew episodes.
We'll see what your feedback looks like.
Yeah, we'll see. We might be having more episodes with Matthew as we enter into the.
I know how to put a teenager to sleep, so maybe my minisodes can be used to help people that are struggling with insomnia. There you go.
All right,
a sleep story about racial tyranny and the expansion of slavery and attempts to stop it.
I love you. All right. Okay, bye. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.